A 6-month-old baby speaks his first word. Not mama or dada, but door. By 18 months, he's reading the New York Times. At 3, he's typing letters in Latin. At 8, he passes the Harvard Medical School anatomy exam and invents his own language. His IQ, somewhere between 250 and 300, higher than Einstein, higher than anyone ever measured. This is William James Sidis, and his story isn't what you think it is. Most people know him as the ultimate failed prodigy, the cautionary tale about pushing children too hard. He was supposed to be the greatest mind of the 20th century. Instead, he died alone in a boarding house. At 46, working as a bookkeeper, carrying a photograph of a woman who'd married someone else. But that narrative, the one you've probably heard, is itself a kind of lie. Because while everyone was busy calling him a failure, Sidis was predicting black holes 14 years before the scientific establishment, writing 1,200-page histories under pseudonyms, and deliberately choosing obscurity over fame. The question isn't why he failed, it's why we needed him to. This is the complete story of the smartest person who ever lived, and it starts in a place you wouldn't expect. New York City, April 1st, 1898, April Fool's Day. The timing would become symbolic in ways no one could have predicted, though whether the joke was on William or on the rest of us remains unclear. His parents, Boris and Sarah Sidis, had fled persecution in Eastern Europe, part of the massive wave of Jewish immigration escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire. They arrived in America with almost nothing except their educations and an absolute conviction that genius could be manufactured. Boris Sidis wasn't just any immigrant father with big dreams. He was a psychologist, eventually becoming a professor at Harvard, pioneering work in abnormal psychology and hypnosis. He'd studied with William James, the founder of American psychology, and when his son was born, he named him after his mentor. The name carried weight, expectation, a promise that this child would matter. Sarah had her own credentials. She'd graduated from Boston University's School of Medicine in 1897, one of the few female physicians of her era. But when William was born, she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She gave up her medical career entirely to focus on her son's education, not supplementing it, not guiding it, creating it from scratch. The Sidis household wasn't normal by any measure. Multiple languages filled the air constantly. Boris spoke Russian, German, and English. Sarah added Hebrew and Yiddish to the mix. Books lined every wall. The parents didn't just value education abstractly. They believed with the fervour of true believers that intelligence was trainable, that genius was a product of environment and early intervention, and that their son would prove it. You have to understand the context. This was the turn of the century, when psychology was young and ambitious, when researchers genuinely believed they could engineer better humans through proper conditioning. Boris had spent years studying the mechanisms of learning, the plasticity of young minds. His son wasn't just his child, he was the experiment that would validate everything Boris believed about human potential. So they started early, absurdly early. At just a few months old, Boris began showing William wooden blocks with letters on them, using techniques borrowed from his hypnosis research to focus the infant's attention. At 6 months, William said door. By 7 months, he'd added moon to his vocabulary. These weren't random baby sounds shaped by parental wishful thinking. These were clear, intentional words. At 8 months, William could feed himself with a spoon, a skill most children don't develop until well past their first birthday. But more remarkably, he could recognise and reproduce the letters on his father's blocks. He had a 4-year-old symbol recognition while still in diapers. Boris and Sarah documented everything, watching their theory come to life in real time. The household operated on a principle they called aggressive curiosity. Every question William asked received a detailed, sophisticated answer. No topic was off limits or dumbed down. If he wondered about something, they provided books, maps, diagrams, whatever tools would let him explore it fully. Sarah spent the family's limited savings on educational materials, turning their home into a private academy for an audience of one. By 18 months, William was reading the New York Times. Not sounding out words or recognizing his name, actually reading, comprehending articles meant for adults. When other toddlers were learning to walk steadily, he was absorbing news about politics and international affairs. At age 3, he taught himself to type on a typewriter and had begun studying Latin. Not children's Latin, not simplified grammar exercises. He was working through texts that university students struggled with. And he was doing it independently, driven by curiosity his parents had carefully cultivated. The progression seemed impossible, yet multiple witnesses confirmed it. By age 6, William had mastered advanced mathematics, working through algebra and geometry that high school students found challenging. He could solve complex problems faster than his father could write them down. But mathematics was just the beginning. Languages fascinated him in a way that suggested something beyond normal talent. By 8 years old, he'd taught himself 8 languages: Latin, Greek, French, Russian, German, Hebrew, Turkish, and Armenian. He didn't just memorize vocabulary, he understood the underlying structures, the grammatical patterns that connected them. And then he did something that still seems incredible. He invented his own language. He called it Vendergood, and he wrote an entire book about it at age 7. The Book of Vendergood described a constructed language with its own grammar, vocabulary, and logical system. Most of the language drew on Latin and Greek roots, but it incorporated elements from German, French, and other Romance languages. What made it remarkable wasn't just that a 7-year-old had created it, it was how sophisticated the structure was. Vendergood distinguished between 8 different grammatical moods, including one Sidis invented himself called strongjable. While most languages use base 10 for counting, Vendergood used base 12, which is actually more mathematically elegant. The system allowed for more efficient calculations and more logical numerical relationships. The manuscript still exists, though it's never been fully published. Linguists who've examined it describe it as genuinely innovative, not just a child's game of making up words. Sidis had identified real limitations in existing languages and designed solutions. At 7 years old, school couldn't contain him. He entered 1st grade carrying a volume of Shakespeare, which probably didn't help him make friends. He graduated from primary school in 7 months, finishing years of curriculum while his classmates were still learning basic arithmetic. Between ages 6 and 8, he wrote at least 4 books on various subjects. One was a treatise on anatomy. Another developed a formula for calculating what day of the week any date in history fell on. At 8, he passed the Harvard Medical School anatomy exam. Let that sink in for a moment. Medical students, adults who'd spent years preparing, took that exam. An 8-year-old passed it. He also passed the entrance exam for MIT, though he wouldn't attend either institution immediately. Boris saw all of this as confirmation. His theories were correct. Genius could be manufactured through proper early education. He began writing about his methods, giving lectures, positioning William as proof that humanity could engineer better versions of itself. Other parents started asking for advice. Researchers wanted to study the boy. Boris was building a reputation as the man who'd cracked the code of human potential. But there was a problem that nobody was paying attention to yet. While William's intellect was racing ahead at an impossible pace, his emotional and social development remained stubbornly ordinary. He was still a child, with a child's need for play, for peers, for a world that made sense in child-sized portions. The discrepancy between his intellectual abilities and his emotional age was creating a gap that would only widen with time. Boris didn't see this as a problem, or if he did, he considered it acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of intellectual development. He'd created a genius. That was what mattered. The rest would sort itself out. In 1907, when William was 9, Boris petitioned Harvard University to admit his son. He brought documentation of William's abilities, test scores, written work. The faculty committee examined the evidence and reached a conclusion that should have been a warning. They acknowledged that William was intellectually capable of university-level work, but they turned him down anyway. Their reasoning was simple. He was too young, not intellectually, but socially and emotionally. Putting a 9-year-old in classes with adults would be setting him up for failure in ways that had nothing to do with academics. They suggested waiting. Boris was furious. This was exactly the kind of conventional thinking that held humanity back. His son was ready. The institution just couldn't see it. But he accepted the delay, at least officially. For the next 2 years, William studied mathematics at Tufts University. He didn't formally enroll. He attended lectures, worked with professors, and spent his time doing something that revealed just how advanced he really was. He found errors in textbooks, mathematical errors, logical inconsistencies that had been printed and reprinted without anyone noticing. And he was studying Einstein's theory of relativity, which had only been published a few years earlier and which most physicists were still struggling to understand. At 11, Harvard ran out of excuses to keep him out. In 1909, William James Sidis became the youngest person ever admitted to Harvard University, breaking a record that had stood since 1674, when Cotton Mather matriculated at 12. The press loved it. Here was a story that wrote itself: the boy genius heading to Harvard at an age when most children were still in elementary school. Newspapers across the country picked it up. William's face appeared in papers from Boston to California. He became, for a moment, the most famous child in America. He wasn't alone at Harvard, not quite. 1909 brought in a cohort of prodigies, young people whose abilities had outpaced their age. Norbert Wiener was there, the future father of cybernetics. Roger Sessions, who'd become a renowned composer. These were exceptional minds, and even among them, William stood out. But standing out came with a cost that was becoming increasingly clear. He was still a child in many ways, awkward and shy, easily overwhelmed by attention. His voice hadn't changed. He giggled at inappropriate moments, and he was about to step onto a stage that would expose every one of these vulnerabilities. On a cold January evening in 1910, about 100 professors and advanced mathematics students gathered in a Harvard lecture hall. They'd come to hear the 11-year-old William Sidis deliver his first public presentation. The topic was four-dimensional bodies, a subject so complex that most of the audience had only theoretical understanding of it. William stood at the front of the room, small for his age, his voice quiet and high-pitched. He had to stop occasionally to stifle giggles, a child's nervous response to stress. But when he spoke about mathematics, something shifted. The awkwardness fell away. For over an hour, he explained four-dimensional geometry with a clarity that left his audience stunned. The lecture was brilliant, not just competent or impressive for his age, but genuinely original in its insights. Professor Daniel F. Comstock from MIT, one of the leading physicists in America, stood up afterward and made a prediction. He said William would become a great astronomical mathematician, a leader in the field. The newspapers quoted him widely. The story spread even further. William James Sidis was officially a phenomenon. Everyone knew his name. Everyone had an opinion about him. And almost no one was paying attention to what that fame was doing to the boy underneath it all. Because while the newspapers were celebrating the genius, while Boris was basking in validation of his theories, while Sarah watched her son prove everything they'd believed about education and potential, William himself was beginning to crack. The pressure of being the smartest person in any room, of having your every action scrutinized and judged, of never being allowed to simply be 11 years old, was building towards something that no amount of intellectual brilliance could solve. The next year, he would have a nervous breakdown, but before that happened, he had to survive Harvard. And Harvard, it turned out, wasn't designed for someone like him. Harvard wasn't built for children. The institution had existed for nearly 3 centuries by the time William arrived, and in all those years it had developed a culture designed for young men transitioning into adulthood. Students lived together in dormitories. They formed social clubs. They competed in sports. They courted women at nearby colleges. They stayed up late arguing about philosophy and politics. They were learning to be adults, and that social education was considered just as important as anything happening in the classroom. William was 11. He didn't fit into any of this. His parents tried to shield him from some of it. They arranged for him to live at home rather than in the dormitories. This was practical, in one sense, keeping him away from the hazing and pranks that older students might inflict on such an obvious target. But it also meant he had no chance to form the casual friendships that develop when people live together. He arrived for classes and left immediately after, a ghost passing through campus. The age gap was impossible to ignore. His classmates were 17, 18, 19 years old. Some were older, veterans returning to complete their education. They were physically mature, socially confident, navigating the complex hierarchies of college life with varying degrees of success. William looked like a child because he was one. He was small, his voice hadn't changed, and he carried himself with the awkwardness of someone who hadn't yet grown into his body. His professors didn't know what to make of him. In class, he was extraordinary. He understood complex mathematical concepts better than students 10 years older. He could see patterns and connections that eluded everyone else. When he spoke about mathematics, he was confident, articulate, brilliant. But the moment class ended, he became a shy, giggling child again. The transformation was jarring. Some professors tried to bridge the gap. They praised his work, encouraged his questions, treated him with respect. Others found him unsettling. There was something unnatural about a child with such adult capabilities. It violated the expected order of development. Children were supposed to be learning their multiplication tables, not deriving original mathematical proofs. The other students were worse. Most ignored him, which was probably the kindest response. Some were actively hostile. They mocked his high voice, his giggling, his short pants. They played pranks, hiding his books or giving him false information about assignments. A few even got physical, pushing him around when professors weren't watching. William had no framework for responding to any of this. He'd spent his entire childhood in an environment where his intelligence was celebrated, where adults hung on his every word. Now he was surrounded by peers who saw him as a target. He tried to be invisible. He sat in the back of classrooms. He kept his head down in the hallways. He spoke only when called upon. But invisibility was impossible for someone who'd been featured in newspapers across the country. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone had opinions about him. He was either a freak of nature or the future of education, depending on who you asked. He was never just a student trying to learn. The mathematics came easily, which was both blessing and curse. He didn't need to study the way other students did. He could glance at a problem and see the solution immediately. This meant he had plenty of free time, but nothing to fill it with. He couldn't join the social activities that occupied his classmates. He couldn't go to parties or join clubs. He was too young for any of it. So he spent his time alone, reading or working on his own mathematical explorations. His parents watched all this with different reactions. Boris saw vindication. His son was at Harvard, proving that early intensive education worked. The fact that William was struggling socially didn't concern him much. Social skills could be developed later. Right now, the important thing was intellectual development. Sarah was more conflicted. She'd given up her medical career to raise William, and she believed deeply in Boris's methods. But she could see that her son was unhappy. She just didn't know what to do about it. Pulling him out of Harvard would mean admitting the experiment had failed, and neither parent was ready to face that possibility. The pressure kept building. Every exam, every paper, every interaction with professors or students was scrutinized not just by William himself, but by everyone watching the prodigy to see if he'd live up to expectations. The newspapers still covered him periodically, updating their readers on the boy genius at Harvard. These articles never mentioned the loneliness, the mockery, the sense that he was performing in a circus rather than receiving an education. Then in 1911, something broke. William had a nervous breakdown. The details are sketchy because the family kept it quiet. We know he stopped attending classes. We know Boris took him to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Boris had established his psychotherapeutic institute. We know William spent several months there being treated by his father. What that treatment involved, we can only guess. Boris's methods included rest cures, isolation, sometimes hypnosis. Whatever happened during those months, William eventually returned to Harvard to continue his studies. But something had changed. The breakdown was a warning sign that everyone chose to ignore. Instead of reconsidering whether a child should be put through this kind of pressure, the Sidis family treated it as a temporary setback. William went back to classes. He kept performing at the highest level academically, and everyone pretended the breakdown had been nothing more than a brief interruption. He graduated in 1914, at 16, with a degree in mathematics, magna cum laude. By any objective measure, the Harvard years had been a success. He'd mastered the material, earned his degree, and maintained excellent grades throughout. But if you measured success by happiness, by social development, by any sense of William becoming a whole person rather than just an intellect, the Harvard years had been a disaster. The question was what came next. William was 16 with a Harvard degree and nowhere to go. He was too young to start a conventional career. He'd already proven everything his parents wanted him to prove. And he'd spent the last 5 years being treated as a freak, something to be stared at and studied rather than accepted as a person. Rice University in Houston offered him a teaching position. A 16-year-old with no graduate degree was going to teach mathematics to college students. It seemed like the logical next step. William could continue his academic career while working toward advanced degrees. His parents approved. The press loved it. Another chapter in the amazing story of William James Sidis, child prodigy. No one asked William what he wanted, or if they did, no one listened to the answer. Because by this point, William had very clear ideas about the life he wanted to live, and it had nothing to do with standing in front of classrooms full of students who would inevitably mock and ridicule him. But he went to Rice anyway, because that's what was expected. That's what the narrative demanded. The boy genius moves on to the next academic triumph, proving again that early intensive education creates superior minds. Rice was worse than Harvard. At Harvard, at least the students had been roughly his peers intellectually, even if they were older. At Rice, he was supposed to be the authority figure, the professor, the one in control. But he looked like a child. He sounded like a child. And the students, many of whom were older than him, weren't about to take instruction from someone they saw as a joke. They ridiculed him openly. They laughed during his lectures. They questioned his authority at every opportunity. They played pranks that were sometimes cruel. William, who'd never developed the social skills to handle conflict, had no tools for managing a hostile classroom. He couldn't command respect through force of personality. He couldn't deflect mockery with humour. He could only know mathematics, and that wasn't enough. He lasted 8 months. 8 months of daily humiliation, of trying to teach students who refused to learn from him, of being treated as a curiosity rather than a colleague by the other faculty members. Then he quit. He went back to Cambridge, back to his parents' house, back to the only place that had ever felt relatively safe. But he couldn't go back to Harvard as a student. He'd already graduated, so he enrolled in law school instead, thinking maybe a different field would offer a different experience. It didn't. Harvard Law School brought the same problems as Harvard College. He was still too young, still too socially awkward, still too famous for his own good. And now he was studying something he had no real interest in. The law required different skills than mathematics. It involved human relationships, social dynamics, rhetorical persuasion? William could memorize statutes and precedents easily enough, but the practical application of law, the part that actually mattered, remained forever out of reach. The female students were particularly cruel. Some of them played elaborate pranks, pretending to have romantic feelings for him as a joke. William, who'd never had any romantic experience, who'd announced publicly that he planned to remain celibate, didn't understand what was happening until the humiliation was complete. These weren't sophisticated pranks. They were basic cruelty, the kind of thing teenagers do to outcasts. But they worked because William had no defenses against them. He left Harvard Law School without completing his degree, another failure to add to the growing list. The pattern was becoming clear. William could master any intellectual challenge, but he couldn't function in the social environments where that intelligence was supposed to be applied. He was brilliant and useless at the same time. By 1918, he'd completely abandoned the academic path his parents had designed for him. He was 20 years old, with a Harvard degree and multiple failed attempts at continuing his education. He should have been at the beginning of a distinguished career. Instead, he was adrift, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that had never made space for someone like him. Then he discovered socialism. For the first time in his life, William found a community that seemed to accept him. The socialist movement in Boston was diverse, welcoming people from all backgrounds. They cared about ideas and commitment, not social status or conventional success. William attended meetings, read radical literature, participated in discussions about economic justice and workers' rights. He finally felt like he belonged somewhere. On May 1st, 1919, he joined a May Day parade in Boston. It was a celebration of workers' rights, a demonstration of socialist solidarity. The parade turned violent when police moved in to break it up. William was in the middle of it, carrying a red flag, caught up in the chaos. He was arrested, beaten, and charged with inciting riot under the Sedition Act. During his trial, he told the court he didn't believe in God, that he believed in evolution, that the red flag represented the common blood of humanity. These statements, combined with his fame as a former child prodigy, made him a target. The press covered the trial extensively, portraying him as a fallen genius who'd thrown away his potential for radical politics. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. His parents were horrified. Boris used his connections to have William transferred to his sanatorium instead of prison. It was supposed to be better, more humane, but it also meant William was once again under his father's control, being treated for problems his father had helped create. When he was finally released in 1921, at age 23, William James Sidis made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was done with all of it. Done with fame, done with academia, done with trying to live up to anyone's expectations. From now on, he would live on his own terms, even if those terms looked like failure to everyone else. He disappeared. That's the only way to describe what William did starting in 1921. He vanished into the anonymous mass of American workers, deliberately making himself invisible. The man who'd once been photographed for newspapers across the country now went to extraordinary lengths to avoid recognition. He used aliases, changed jobs constantly, moved between cities. The moment someone recognized him, the moment his past caught up with him, he quit and started over somewhere else. He took work as a bookkeeper, low-level accounting, adding numbers in ledgers, basic arithmetic that a child could do. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy who'd lectured Harvard professors on four-dimensional mathematics was now adding columns of figures for small businesses. When asked why, he had a simple answer. The very sight of a mathematical formula makes me physically ill. All I want to do is run an adding machine, but they won't let me alone. Oh, that last part was the problem. People wouldn't let him alone. His name still carried weight, still sparked recognition. Someone would hear William Sidis and remember the newspaper stories, the child prodigy, the Harvard lecture. They'd start asking questions, wanting to know what happened, why he was working such a menial job, what it was like being so smart. Every time, he'd quit and disappear again. This pattern repeated for years. Boston, New York, smaller cities where he thought he might go unnoticed, always the same cycle. Find a job, work quietly, get recognized, leave. But something else was happening during these years, something that wouldn't be discovered until much later. William was still working, not in offices or universities, but alone, in rented rooms, using pseudonyms, pursuing ideas that had nothing to do with the expectations everyone had placed on him. In 1925, a book appeared called The Animate and the Inanimate. No publisher, just a small printing. The author's name was William James Sidis, though almost nobody noticed. The book was strange, ambitious, completely outside mainstream science. It proposed a cosmological theory involving what Sidis called negative tendencies and positive tendencies in the universe, sections where the normal laws of physics reversed. Buried in this theory was something remarkable. 14 years before the physicist Subramanian Chandrasekhar would receive credit for the concept, Sidis predicted the existence of black holes. He described regions of space where matter collapsed under its own gravity, creating zones from which not even light could escape. The mathematics were there. The concept was clear. He'd worked it out alone, without access to university resources or colleagues to discuss ideas with. Nobody paid attention. The book sold maybe a handful of copies. Scientists didn't read work by self-published authors with no institutional affiliation. The few who encountered it dismissed it as the eccentric ramblings of a has-been prodigy. Decades later, Buckminster Fuller, who'd known William at Harvard, stumbled across a copy. He wrote, "Imagine my excitement and joy on being handed this Xerox of Sidis' 1925 book, in which he clearly predicts the black hole. I find his whole book to be a fine cosmological piece." But in 1925, nobody cared. William had removed himself from the system that could have recognized his work, and the system had no mechanism for noticing what happened outside it. He kept writing under various pseudonyms. Frank Falupa published a treatise on streetcar transfers. Not a joke, an actual scholarly work analysing public transportation systems and proposing methods to increase efficiency. William had become fascinated with streetcars, with the complex networks of routes and schedules, with the transfer tickets that passengers collected. He coined a term for people like him, peridromophiles, lovers of travel and transportation systems. He collected transfer tickets from cities across America, thousands of them, carefully organised, catalogued by route and date. To outsiders, it looked like a bizarre obsession. To William, it was a system to understand, patterns to decode, problems to solve without the pressure of anyone's expectations. He invented a perpetual calendar, not a theoretical concept, an actual working device that he patented in 1930, a rotary calendar that automatically adjusted for leap years, elegantly solving a problem that had frustrated calendar designers for centuries. The patent application listed him under his real name. He couldn't avoid it for legal documents, but nobody connected the William Sidis, who'd patented a calendar, with the child prodigy from 20 years earlier. He wrote a 1,200-page history of the United States, never published, never shown to anyone, just written because he wanted to understand how the country had developed, how its systems had evolved. He wrote The Tribes and the States under the pseudonym John W. Shattuck, a history of Native American tribes in the Northeast, focusing on their governance systems, their treaties, their methods of recording history through wampum belts. Sidis had taught himself to read wampum patterns. He explained, "The weaving of wampum belts is a sort of writing by means of belts of coloured beads, in which the various designs of beads denoted different ideas according to a definitely accepted system." He was studying indigenous knowledge systems, finding sophistication in places academic historians ignored, doing original research with no institutional support, no colleagues, no recognition. Why? Because he could. Because these subjects interested him. Because nobody was forcing him to study them, or measuring his progress, or turning his work into evidence of his worth as a human being. The mathematics that had been forced on him as a child, that had made him famous, that had ruined his life, he'd genuinely grown to hate it. Not the concepts themselves, but what they represented. The pressure, the expectations, the way his abilities had been weaponized against his own happiness. But he couldn't stop being curious, couldn't stop seeing patterns and wanting to understand them. So he channeled that curiosity into subjects nobody cared about, using names nobody recognized, working in obscurity, because obscurity was the only place he could breathe. His colleagues at the various bookkeeping jobs where he worked remembered him as quiet, competent, unremarkable, exactly what he wanted to be. He showed up, did the work accurately, didn't socialize much, went home. Perfect, anonymous, safe. During these years, William developed his only real romantic attachment. Martha Foley, the Irish socialist he'd met briefly during his arrest in 1919, had stayed in his mind. He'd kissed her once. Just once. Probably his only kiss ever. She'd moved on, married someone else, built a life. But William carried her photograph in his pocket. It's almost unbearably sad. This man whose emotional development had been sacrificed for intellectual advancement, who'd been denied normal childhood experiences, who'd been pushed into adult intellectual circles before he understood basic social interaction, he could only love, theoretically, from a distance, through a photograph. Martha Foley had no idea. She'd gone on with her life, probably barely remembered the awkward young man from that May Day parade. But for William, she represented something he'd never had and couldn't figure out how to get: a normal human connection. He never pursued her, never wrote to her, never tried to renew contact. He just carried her picture and kept living his solitary life. The pattern continued through the 1920s and 1930s. Work, write, move, repeat. He was productive in his own way, pursuing knowledge on his own terms. But he was also profoundly isolated, cut off from any community that might have valued his work. Then in August 1937, everything collapsed again. The New Yorker magazine published a profile titled, "Where Are They Now? April Fool." The author was James Thurber, better known for humorous essays and stories. He'd tracked down William Sidis, now 39 years old, living in a shabby Boston rooming house. The article was cruel, condescending, mocking. It described William as a hall-bedroom recluse, focused on his collection of streetcar transfers, his menial jobs, his poverty. The tone suggested this was what happened to child prodigies who failed to live up to their promise. Thurber described William's living conditions in detail: the small room, the second-hand furniture, the stacks of papers and books. He made William's interests sound pathetic. The man who'd lectured at Harvard was now obsessed with bus schedules. How sad, how disappointing. The article revealed William's various pseudonyms, exposed his attempts at privacy, tracked his movements across different cities. It was an invasion, a dissection, a public humiliation. And it was published in The New Yorker, one of the most prestigious magazines in America, read by hundreds of thousands of people. The story got picked up by newspapers across the country. Suddenly everyone knew where William Sidis was and what he'd become. The anonymity he'd spent 16 years building was destroyed in a few thousand words. The article claimed William had wasted his potential, thrown away his gifts, failed to become what he should have been. It never considered that maybe he'd succeeded at exactly what he wanted, escaping the life others had planned for him. William was devastated. The exposure, the mockery, the violation of the privacy he'd fought so hard to maintain, it was everything he'd been trying to avoid. He did something uncharacteristic. He fought back. He filed a lawsuit against The New Yorker and its parent company for invasion of privacy and libel. The suit claimed the article had exposed him to public scorn, ridicule, and contempt, and caused him grievous mental anguish and humiliation. The case worked its way through the courts. Lower courts dismissed it, arguing that William was a public figure who'd forfeited his right to privacy by being famous as a child. Think about that logic. Because his parents had pushed him into the spotlight when he was 11 years old, before he could consent to any of it, he'd permanently given up his right to live privately as an adult. The appeals court upheld the dismissal. Judge Charles Edward Clark expressed sympathy for William, but ruled that the court couldn't afford to all the intimate details of private life and absolute immunity from the prying of the press. The decision would become significant in media law, cited in debates about press freedom versus privacy rights. But for William, it was just another loss. Rather than continue fighting, he settled in early 1944 for $3,000. Barely enough to cover his legal expenses. The case had taken years. The exposure had continued throughout. He went back to his quiet life, but something had broken. The lawsuit had required him to be William James Sidis again, publicly, in court documents and newspaper reports. The name he'd been trying to escape had been forced back onto him. A few months after the settlement, on July 17, 1944, William's landlady found him collapsed in his room. He'd suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 46 years old. He died there, in that small room, surrounded by his books and papers and collections. He was still carrying Martha Foley's photograph in his pocket. She'd been married for years, had her own life, probably hadn't thought about William Sidis in decades, but he'd kept her picture for 25 years. The newspapers reported his death widely. Most of the obituaries focused on his childhood fame, calling him a former child prodigy or failed genius. They mentioned the Harvard lecture, the predictions that he'd become a great mathematician. Very few mentioned his actual later work. The books he'd written, the theories he'd developed, the patent he'd received. The narrative was already set. William James Sidis was a cautionary tale about wasted potential. His sister Helena preserved his papers. Later, she would try to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he'd been a serious scholar whose work deserved recognition. But the damage was done. In popular memory, William Sidis became the definitive example of the child prodigy who burned out, who couldn't handle the pressure, who ended up a failure. That story is easier to tell than the truth. The truth is more complicated, messier, harder to fit into a simple morale about parenting or education or genius. The truth requires looking past the headlines, past the easy narrative of failure, into what William Sidis actually accomplished during those decades he spent trying to be invisible. While working anonymous jobs, moving from city to city whenever recognition threatened, William was writing. Not under his own name. Never under his own name. He used pseudonyms, published through obscure channels, and made sure nothing could be traced back to William James Sidis, former child prodigy. In 1925, he published a book called The Animate and the Inanimate under his own name, one of the rare exceptions. It was a work of cosmology, dense and technical, proposing theories about the nature of the universe that seemed almost incomprehensible to most readers. The book argued that the universe was infinite, containing sections where the laws of physics operated normally, alongside regions where they reversed. Time could flow backward in these negative tendency regions. Matter and energy behaved differently. The second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, might not be absolute. Most reviewers dismissed it. The few who read it carefully found the ideas bizarre, untestable, products of an eccentric mind unmoored from scientific rigor. But buried in that strange cosmological treatise was something remarkable. Sidis predicted the existence of black holes. 14 years before Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar would do the same work that eventually won him a Nobel Prize, William Sidis described regions of space where gravity became so intense that nothing, not even light, could escape. He didn't call them black holes. He didn't have the mathematical framework that would later make the concept precise, but he intuited their existence through his understanding of how matter and energy might behave under extreme conditions. Decades later, Buckminster Fuller, the architect and systems theorist who'd been William's classmate at Harvard, discovered a Xerox copy of The Animate and the Inanimate. He wrote in a letter, "Imagine my excitement and joy on being handed this Xerox of Sidis' 1925 book, in which he clearly predicts the black hole." Fuller continued, "I find his whole book to be a fine cosmological piece. I find him focusing on the same subjects that fascinate me, and coming to about the same conclusions as those I've published." This wasn't a failed prodigy producing worthless work. This was a serious thinker, making genuine contributions to scientific thought, doing it entirely outside the academic system that had rejected him. The cosmology book was just the beginning. Under the pseudonym Frank Folupa, William wrote an exhaustive treatise on streetcar transfer tickets. Not as a joke or an eccentric hobby, but as a serious study of urban transportation systems. He'd coined a term for himself and others who shared this interest. Peridromophile, someone fascinated with transportation research. The streetcar book identified practical methods for increasing public transit usage, optimizing routes, and improving the efficiency of urban transportation networks. It sounds absurd until you realize he was analyzing complex systems, applying the same mathematical and logical abilities that had made him famous as a child, just directing them towards something the academic establishment considered beneath notice. In 1930, he received a patent for a rotary perpetual calendar. The invention accounted for leap years and could calculate the correct day of the week for any date, past or future. It was practical, elegant, and demonstrated that his mathematical abilities hadn't atrophied despite his claims that the very sight of a mathematical formula makes me physically ill, or that statement, widely quoted as evidence of his burnout, was probably protective colouring, a way to make people leave him alone. Because while he was saying he couldn't stand mathematics, he was inventing calendrical systems and publishing books on cosmology. He wrote a 1,200-page history of the United States. Not the conventional narrative taught in schools, but an alternative history focusing on economic and social forces, the movements of ordinary people rather than the decisions of great men. Under the pseudonym John W. Shattuck, he wrote The Tribes and the States, an extensive history of Native Americans focusing on northeastern tribes. He never completed it, and it remained unpublished at his death, but the manuscript shows sophisticated historical thinking. His method was unusual. He relied heavily on wampum belts as primary sources, arguing they represented a form of writing that historians had overlooked. The weaving of wampum belts is a sort of writing by means of belts of coloured beads in which the various designs denoted different ideas according to a definitely accepted system. He was trying to recover indigenous perspectives, to read history through sources that European-trained historians dismissed as mere artifacts. Decades before post-colonial historiography became an academic movement, William Sidis was attempting to decenter European narratives and take Native American records seriously as texts. These weren't the projects of a burned-out failure. These were the works of someone pursuing genuine intellectual interests, someone who'd found ways to study what fascinated him without needing approval or recognition from the institutions that had hurt him. But there's another layer to this. William's writing during these years shows something that gets lost in the prodigy narrative. He was political. His arrest in 1919, his 18-month sentence for participating in a socialist parade, that wasn't youthful rebellion or confusion. He believed in these causes. When arrested, he told the court he believed in evolution, that he didn't believe in God. He carried a red flag, and when asked what it meant, he said, "It stood for the common blood of humanity." The authorities sentenced him to 18 months in prison under the Sedition Act. His parents intervened, using their connections to have him transferred to his father's sanatorium instead, then arranged work at MIT as an alternative to jail time. But the episode reveals something important. William Sidis wasn't apolitical. He wasn't just a mind disconnected from social concerns. He'd developed strong beliefs about economic justice, about socialism, about the common humanity that transcended national boundaries. And it was during this period, in the chaos of the May Day parade and its aftermath, that he met Martha Foley. She was Irish, a socialist activist, someone who shared his political convictions. They connected in a way William had never experienced before. For the first time, someone saw him not as a prodigy or a curiosity, but as a person with ideas that mattered. The relationship was brief. It never progressed beyond a single kiss. Martha moved on with her life, married someone else, built a career as a literary editor and writer. She probably thought of William Sidis rarely, if at all, in the decades that followed. But William kept her photograph in his pocket for the next 25 years. Until the day he died, he carried that picture with him. A reminder of the one person who'd seen him as fully human, who'd connected with him intellectually and emotionally without the weight of his childhood fame crushing everything. His biographer later wrote that Sidis could only love with his head. Maybe that's true. Maybe his emotional development really was stunted by the pressure cooker of his early education. Or maybe Martha Foley was simply the only person who'd ever treated him like an equal, and he never found that again. The work continued. Through the 1920s and 1930s, William published, invented, researched, all while maintaining his anonymity. He moved from job to job, city to city, staying one step ahead of recognition. His colleagues from these years remembered him as quiet, competent, unremarkable, which was exactly what he wanted. He'd found a way to live on his own terms, pursuing knowledge for its own sake, rather than for fame or approval. Then in 1937, everything shattered again. The New Yorker published Where Are They Now? April Fool, written by James Thurber. The article tracked down William Sidis, invaded his privacy, and portrayed him as an eccentric failure living in a shabby rooming house, collecting streetcar transfers and pursuing bizarre hobbies. The tone was mocking, condescending, designed to entertain readers at William's expense. It described him as someone who'd squandered his early promise, who'd retreated from greatness into pathetic obscurity. The article devastated him, not just because it exposed his carefully guarded privacy, but because it misrepresented everything he'd accomplished. The serious scholarly work became bizarre hobbies. His choice to live quietly became evidence of failure. His continued intellectual productivity was ignored entirely. This was the moment when William decided to fight back. The lawsuit, the years of litigation, the appeals that went nowhere. The courts ruled that because he'd been famous as a child, he'd permanently forfeited his right to privacy as an adult. Think about what that means. Because his parents pushed him into the spotlight at age 11, before he could consent, he could never escape. He'd been branded with fame as a child, and that brand was permanent. The settlement, in early 1944, gave him $3,000, barely enough to cover his legal expenses. The case had become another chapter in the public story of William James Sidis, failed prodigy, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. He went back to his small room, his bookkeeping job, his private research, but something had changed. The lawsuit had required him to be William James Sidis again, publicly, in court documents and newspaper reports. The name he'd tried to escape had been forced back onto him. A few months later, he died. The cerebral hemorrhage was sudden. His landlady found him collapsed, called for help, but it was too late. He was 46 years old. The newspapers reported his death widely, most focusing on his childhood fame. Former child prodigy dies at 46, Harvard's youngest student found dead. The obituaries mentioned the lecture on four-dimensional bodies, the predictions he'd become a great mathematician, the early promise. Very few mentioned his actual work, the books he'd published, the theories he'd developed, the patent he'd received. The narrative had been set decades earlier, and his death just confirmed it. William James Sidis was a cautionary tale about wasted genius. His sister Helena tried to correct the record. She preserved his papers, argued that he'd been a serious scholar whose work deserved recognition. She claimed he'd taken an IQ test a few years before his death and scored the very highest that had ever been obtained, somewhere between 250 and 300. But Helena had a history of exaggerating family achievements. Abraham Sperling, the psychologist who supposedly reported this score, never provided documentation. The story became part of the mythology, impossible to verify, probably inflated. What we're left with is the actual work, the cosmology book that predicted black holes, the transportation research, the historical manuscripts, the calendar patent, the constructed language he'd invented at age 7, the mathematical theorems, the multiple books written under pseudonyms. These weren't the products of a burned-out failure. They were the accomplishments of someone who'd found a way to pursue knowledge outside the system that had broken him. But the failure narrative stuck. It was easier to tell, more satisfying. It let people shake their heads and say, "See what happens when you push children too hard? See what happens when parents chase genius instead of happiness?" The story became a template, a warning, proof that pushing children damages them irreparably. But there's something deeply wrong with that reading. Start with the obvious problem. William didn't stop producing. He never stopped thinking, creating, working. The narrative says he gave up on intellectual life, but his bibliography tells a different story entirely. Between 1925 and his death in 1944, William published multiple books under pseudonyms. He wasn't hiding from intellectual work. He was hiding from the identity, William James Sidis, that the public had constructed for him. The cosmology book predicting black holes came out in 1925. That's not the work of someone who's given up. That's cutting-edge theoretical physics being done by someone working alone, without institutional support, publishing under his own name, because the work mattered more than anonymity. The transportation research happened throughout the 1930s. Detailed, systematic analysis of urban transit systems. He coined the term peridromophile for people who study these systems. He received a patent for a perpetual calendar that accounted for leap years. These aren't hobbies, they're contributions to their respective fields. The history of Native Americans ran to over 1,000 pages. Unpublished at his death, yes, but completed. Written under a pseudonym because he knew his real name would overshadow the content. The work drew on wampum belts as primary sources, treating indigenous record-keeping systems as legitimate historical documents, decades before mainstream historians would do the same. So what actually failed here? Not William's intellect, not his productivity, not even his ability to find meaning in his work. What failed was the system's ability to accommodate someone who refused to perform genius the way institutions demanded. Harvard wanted him to become a professor, to publish under his real name, to build a visible academic career. He refused. That's not failure. That's choice. The media wanted him to remain the child prodigy forever, to justify their early predictions, to validate the story they told about him. He refused. Again, not failure, choice. His parents wanted him to fulfill their theories about education, to prove that genius could be manufactured through the right inputs. He refused. Same pattern. Every institution in William's life needed him to be something he didn't want to be. And when he chose differently, they called it failure. but look at what he actually achieved. The cosmology book alone should have established him as a serious thinker. Buckminster Fuller, decades later, wrote in excitement about discovering that Sidis had predicted black holes 14 years before Chandrasekhar. Fuller called it magnificent thinking and writing, said Sidis was focusing on the same subjects that fascinate me and coming to about the same conclusions. This is peer recognition from one of the 20th century's most innovative minds. Fuller understood what the popular narrative missed. William had continued doing serious intellectual work. He'd just done it on his own terms. The transportation research wasn't trivial either. Urban transit systems were becoming crucial to modern cities. Understanding how they worked, how to optimize them, how to increase usage, this was practical, important work. But because William was working as a bookkeeper and publishing under a pseudonym, nobody connected the research to the former child prodigy. The Native American history represented years of careful scholarship. William was treating indigenous sources with respect and attention that most academic historians of his era weren't showing. He was ahead of his time methodologically, but the work remained unpublished partly because he knew his name would become the story, not the content. This is what happens when someone becomes famous before they can consent to it. Every subsequent action gets interpreted through that fame. If William had been an unknown researcher publishing on cosmology, transportation, and indigenous history, scholars would have recognized the quality of the work. But because he was the failed child prodigy, everything he did became evidence of either continued failure or tragic waste. The lawsuit against the New Yorker reveals something important about William's understanding of his situation. He knew exactly what was being done to him. The article had portrayed his life as pathetic, his interests as bizarre, his choices as evidence of mental deterioration. He fought back not because he was delusional about his circumstances, but because he understood them perfectly. The court's ruling established a principle that still shapes privacy law. Childhood fame removes your right to adult privacy. If you're pushed into the public eye before you can consent, you can never fully escape. The public's right to know about you, to observe you, to judge you, that becomes permanent. Think about the implications. William didn't choose to give that lecture at age 11. His father arranged it. The newspapers didn't ask his permission to write about him. They made him famous because his story sold papers. And then, for the rest of his life, that fame was used to justify continued invasion of his privacy. The settlement in 1944 gave him $3,000, the equivalent of a few months' salary. After years of litigation, after having his private life exposed again in court documents, after being forced to be William James Sidis, former child prodigy in public records, he got barely enough money to cover his legal costs. And then he died. The cerebral hemorrhage was sudden. His landlady found him collapsed. By the time help arrived, he was gone. The obituaries focused on what he'd been at 11, not what he'd done in the 35 years since. Former child prodigy dies at 46. Harvard's youngest student found dead. The narrative was already written. His death just confirmed it. But here's what the obituaries didn't mention. He was still working when he died, still conducting research, still writing. There were manuscripts in his room, notes for future projects. He hadn't given up. He'd never given up. What he'd given up on was recognition, on fame, on the system that had broken him as a child. The question isn't whether William James Sidis was a failure. The question is what we mean by success. If success means visible achievement, institutional recognition, a celebrated career, then yes, by those metrics, he failed. He refused to play that game. But if success means continuing to pursue knowledge for its own sake, producing original work in multiple fields, maintaining intellectual integrity despite enormous pressure to perform, then he succeeded completely. He chose privacy over fame, autonomy over recognition, quiet productivity over celebrated achievement, and the world called him a failure for it. The story of William James Sidis isn't really about a child prodigy who couldn't handle the pressure. It's about a person who figured out what mattered to him and refused to compromise, even when that refusal cost him everything the world said he should want. The cosmology book exists. The transportation research exists. The historical manuscripts exist. The patent exists. These aren't the products of failure. They're the products of someone who found a way to work despite the system, not because of it. But the failure narrative serves a purpose. It lets people feel better about not pushing their own children too hard. It confirms that genius isn't worth the cost. It suggests that normal development is superior to exceptional ability. And maybe that's true for some children. Maybe most children shouldn't be educated the way William was. But that doesn't make his life a cautionary tale. It makes it a specific case with specific circumstances that can't be generalized. The real cautionary tale isn't about education methods. It's about what happens when we turn children into public spectacles before they're old enough to consent, when we make them famous for being exceptional, when we invest in narratives about them that they can never escape. William spent his entire adult life trying to be invisible. He changed names, changed cities, changed jobs whenever someone recognized him. He published under pseudonyms. He avoided anything that would draw attention. And still, the New Yorker found him. Still, the journalists wrote about him. Still, the public felt entitled to know what had become of the child prodigy. His death finally gave him what he'd wanted his entire adult life, the ability to be left alone. But even that didn't last. The obituaries, the biographies, the articles that followed, they all kept telling the same story. Failed prodigy, wasted genius, cautionary tale. The story we tell about William James Sidis says more about us than it does about him. It reveals what we value, what we fear, how we think about intelligence and achievement and success. We want prodigies to fulfill their promise. We want early brilliance to lead to recognized achievement. We want the story to have a satisfying ending where exceptional ability translates into exceptional accomplishment that we can all see and admire. When that doesn't happen, we call it failure. We ignore the possibility that the person might have chosen differently, that they might have had their own definition of success. That visible achievement might not have been what mattered to them. William James Sidis lived exactly the life he said he wanted to live. He told reporters at 16 that he wanted to live in seclusion, that he wanted privacy, that he had no interest in fame or recognition, and he spent the next 30 years doing exactly that. He produced serious intellectual work, he supported himself financially, he maintained relationships with the few people he trusted, he continued learning, thinking, creating until the day he died. By his own definition, he succeeded. By society's definition, he failed. The question isn't which definition is correct. The question is why society's definition gets to override the individual's. Why we feel entitled to judge someone else's life choices. Why we can't accept that maybe, just maybe, he knew what he wanted better than we do. The modern discourse around William Sidis reveals something uncomfortable about how we process exceptional ability. We've constructed an entire framework for understanding genius that requires public validation. Patents, publications, recognition, awards. These are the markers we use to measure intellectual achievement. Remove them, and we're left uncertain, unable to categorize, forced to confront the possibility that intelligence might exist independent of external validation. This creates a problem when someone like William deliberately removes themselves from that validation system. We can't measure him by conventional standards because he rejected those standards. His refusal to participate becomes interpreted as inability to succeed. But what if the refusal was the point? What if opting out of the achievement system was itself the achievement? Consider what that actually required. William had been conditioned from infancy to perform intellectually. His entire early life was structured around demonstrating ability, impressing observers, meeting expectations. Breaking that conditioning, rejecting the rewards that had been dangled since childhood, choosing obscurity over recognition, that takes extraordinary psychological strength. Most prodigies can't do it. They remain trapped in the system that created them, continuing to seek the approval they were trained to pursue. William managed to extract himself completely. He rebuilt his identity from scratch, multiple times, in different cities under different names. That's not failure, that's escape. The intellectual work he produced during his anonymous years supports this interpretation. The animate and the inanimate wasn't written for tenure or promotion. There was no grant funding, no institutional support, no expectation of professional advancement. He wrote it because the ideas interested him. Pure intellectual curiosity, uncontaminated by career considerations. That's rarer than you'd think. Academic work almost always contains some element of professional calculation. Which topics are fundable? What will reviewers approve? How does this advance my career? William's later work was free from all that. He thought about what fascinated him and wrote down his conclusions. The work stands or falls on its own merit, not on the author's credentials. Black holes. He predicted black holes in 1925, 14 years before Chandrasekhar's calculations. This wasn't a wild guess. It emerged from his theoretical framework about positive and negative tendencies in the universe, sections where physical laws operate differently. The cosmology was speculative, certainly, but the specific prediction about collapsed stellar objects proved accurate. Buckminster Fuller, reading the book decades later, recognized immediately what Sidis had done. Fuller was himself a visionary thinker, someone who understood how revolutionary ideas often emerge from unconventional frameworks. He saw in Sidis's cosmology something that mainstream physics had missed, a different way of thinking about universal structure that led to correct predictions through unorthodox reasoning. The transportation work was similarly innovative. Analysing streetcar transfer tickets sounds eccentric until you understand what he was actually doing. He was studying urban transportation systems as complex networks, examining how different routing strategies affected efficiency and usage. This was decades before network theory became a formal discipline. He was pioneering an entire field of analysis while working as a bookkeeper. The historical manuscript on Native American tribes demonstrated yet another dimension of his intellect. He was teaching himself to read wampum belts, interpreting historical records that most academics couldn't access. The focus on northeastern tribes wasn't arbitrary. He was documenting histories that were being lost, preserving knowledge that mainstream historians were ignoring. 1,200 pages on American history. Think about that. He researched and wrote 1,200 pages while working full-time at jobs deliberately chosen to be intellectually undemanding. He was producing serious scholarship without institutional resources, without libraries or research assistants or professional networks, just his own intelligence and whatever books he could access. The calendar patent in 1930 showed he was still engaging with practical problems. A perpetual calendar accounting for leap years might seem trivial, but it required mathematical precision and mechanical ingenuity. He solved it elegantly, received the patent, and presumably collected some royalties. Then he moved on to something else. This pattern sustained intellectual productivity across multiple fields while maintaining complete anonymity, contradicts every element of the failure narrative. Failed prodigies don't produce this volume of work. They burn out, turn bitter, abandon intellectual pursuits entirely. William kept thinking, kept creating, kept pushing into new areas of knowledge for 25 years. The New Yorker article in 1937 violated something fundamental. Not just William's privacy, though it certainly did that. It violated the social contract between public and private life. William had withdrawn from public life deliberately. He'd spent 16 years building an anonymous existence. He'd committed no crimes, held no public office, wielded no power over others. He was a private citizen, working a regular job. And the New Yorker decided his privacy didn't matter, because he'd once been famous as a child. The article's tone, mocking, condescending, openly contemptuous, revealed what the magazine thought of someone who'd rejected conventional success. Here was the child genius living in a shabby rooming house, collecting streetcar transfers, working as an adding machine operator. How pathetic. How disappointing. The article's author, James Thurber, apparently saw no ethical issue with hunting down a man who'd explicitly chosen seclusion and exposing his private life for entertainment. The magazine's editors agreed. They published it knowing William would be humiliated, knowing it would destroy the anonymity he'd carefully constructed, knowing it would cause him distress. William's lawsuit was doomed from the start. The legal system in 1937 offered almost no protection for privacy rights. The judge's decision acknowledged that William had been exposed to public scorn, ridicule, and contempt, and had suffered grievous mental anguish. But the court ruled that once someone becomes a public figure, even involuntarily as a child, they forfeit the right to privacy permanently. Think about what that means. A child displayed to the public by his parents loses the right to private life forever. No statute of limitations, no opportunity to withdraw consent that was never given in the first place. The fame imposed on you at age 11 follows you until death. The settlement, $3,000, barely covered legal costs. The real cost was the renewed publicity. Every newspaper that reported on the lawsuit repeated the basic story. Former child prodigy, now working menial jobs, living in obscurity. A cautionary tale about wasted potential. The lawsuit meant to protect his privacy instead generated more press attention than he'd received in years. 7 years later, William died. Cerebral hemorrhage, sudden and final. He was 46 years old, living in a modest lodging in Brookline, still working as a bookkeeper, still carrying Martha Foley's photograph in his pocket. His landlady found him collapsed in his room. By the time medical help arrived, he was gone. The obituaries wrote themselves. Former child prodigy dies in obscurity. Brilliant youth ends life as office worker. The same story, told the same way, with the same implied moral. Genius squandered, potential unrealized, a life that could have been great reduced to mundane existence. His sister Helena preserved his papers. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what William had actually accomplished. She'd grown up in the same household, experienced the same pressures, watched her brother's public humiliation. She knew the manuscripts represented serious intellectual work. She tried to ensure they'd be properly evaluated, but the narrative was already set. By the time scholars might have reassessed William's later work, the story of his failure was so firmly established that reconsidering it felt like revisionism. A few academics examined his cosmology manuscript and acknowledged its prescient elements. Fuller's letter praising the animate and the inanimate went largely unnoticed. The transportation analysis was ignored entirely. The historical manuscript on Native American tribes remained unpublished. 1,200 pages of original research lost because the author's name carried too much baggage. Publishers weren't interested in work by a failed prodigy. Academic historians didn't take seriously scholarship produced outside institutional channels. The knowledge William had gathered and preserved simply vanished. His calendar patent existed as a physical artifact, proof of mechanical ingenuity, but nobody connected it to the larger pattern of intellectual productivity. It was treated as an isolated curiosity, not evidence of sustained creative thinking. The IQ claims that emerged after his death complicated everything further. His sister, eager to defend her brother's legacy, reportedly claimed he'd scored between 250 and 300 on an intelligence test. Whether this test actually occurred, whether these scores are meaningful, whether they represent accurate measurement. All of this remains disputed. What's certain is that the number became part of the legend. Highest IQ ever recorded. The claim is unprovable and probably meaningless, but it persists. It gives people a concrete figure to attach to William's story, a number that seems to quantify his genius while actually obscuring the more complex reality of his intellectual life. Modern discussions of William often focus on that IQ figure. Was it really that high? Could it have been measured accurately? What does it mean? These questions miss the point entirely. Intelligence isn't a single number. It's not a score that can be measured like height or weight. It's a complex constellation of abilities that manifest differently in different contexts. William's intelligence manifested in his ability to learn languages rapidly, to understand complex mathematical concepts intuitively, to see patterns others missed, to make connections across disparate fields. But it also manifested in his ability to survive psychologically despite extraordinary pressure, to rebuild his life repeatedly, to find satisfaction in work others considered beneath him. The last photograph of William shows a man who looks older than 46. The face is tired, the expression guarded. He's dressed simply, unremarkably. Nothing in the image suggests exceptional intelligence or achievement. He looks exactly like what he'd worked so hard to become. Ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. That photograph captures something the newspaper stories never could. This is what successful escape looks like. Not triumph, not vindication, but simple ordinariness. The ability to walk down a street unrecognized, to work a job without being treated as a curiosity, to exist without constant public scrutiny. William achieved that ordinariness, but at what cost? For 23 years from 1921 until his death in 1944, he lived exactly as he'd wanted. No public scrutiny, no expectations, no pressure to perform. He worked his bookkeeping jobs, pursued his private research, collected his transfer tickets, and remained anonymous. Success by his own definition, yet something haunts that definition. The photograph shows a man who looks defeated rather than content. The ordinariness he achieved wasn't peaceful obscurity, it was exhausted hiding. Consider what he gave up to maintain that anonymity. When colleagues discovered his mathematical abilities, he quit rather than risk exposure. When his transportation research could have contributed to actual policy discussions, he published under pseudonyms that prevented recognition. When his historical manuscript on Native American tribes could have advanced scholarship, he left it unpublished because his name would attract attention. He sacrificed impact for invisibility every time. That's not the choice of someone who found peace. That's the choice of someone still running. The manuscripts left behind tell a different story than the failed prodigy narrative suggests. The animate and the inanimate wasn't just cosmological speculation, it was serious theoretical work that anticipated concepts in physics by decades. The transportation analysis wasn't eccentric hobby material, it was systematic research that identified practical improvements to public transit systems. The Native American history wasn't amateur dabbling, it was original scholarship based on primary sources most historians weren't consulting. This body of work represents sustained intellectual productivity across multiple disciplines over 2 decades. That's not failure. That's exactly what successful scholarly careers look like, minus the institutional affiliation and public recognition. But William couldn't see it that way. To him, any recognition was dangerous. Any acknowledgement of his abilities threatened the anonymity he'd built. So the work remained hidden, pseudonymous, disconnected from his identity. The tragedy isn't that he stopped being a genius. The tragedy is that he never stopped, but convinced himself he had to hide it. Martha Foley's photograph, carried until his death, represents something William could never reconcile. She was the only person he'd allowed himself to love, and even that relationship remained unconsummated, unresolved. She married someone else, built a different life, while William carried her image like a talisman of what might have been. That photograph symbolizes all the things William denied himself in his pursuit of invisibility: connection, intimacy, the vulnerability required for actual relationship. He'd learned too well that being known meant being hurt, so he chose not to be known, even by people who might have cared about him rather than his abilities. The loneliness of that choice doesn't appear in the public records, but it's there in every job he quit when recognized, every manuscript he published under false names, every transfer ticket he collected as a substitute for human connection. His only companion, a photograph of a woman who'd married someone else decades earlier. The newspapers covered his death extensively, not because of what he'd accomplished in the previous 23 years, but because of what he'd represented at 11. The headlines focused on the child prodigy, the Harvard phenomenon, the boy who delivered that famous lecture on four-dimensional bodies. Most articles mentioned his decline, his choice to work menial jobs, his rejection of mathematics. The narrative was set: brilliant child becomes ordinary man, wasted potential, cautionary tale. Few bothered examining what he'd actually done during those supposedly wasted years. The manuscripts existed, but who would take them seriously when the story of failure was so much more compelling? His funeral was small, private, exactly as he would have wanted. Helena attended, along with a few other family members. No former colleagues from Harvard, no representatives from the academic world that had once celebrated him. He'd successfully disappeared from that world decades earlier. Helena inherited William's papers and manuscripts. She understood, better than anyone, what they represented. She'd watched her brother's public humiliation, understood his desperate need for privacy, but she also recognized the value of his later work. She tried to ensure it would be properly evaluated, but the narrative was too strong. Publishers weren't interested in work by a failed prodigy. Academics didn't take seriously scholarship produced outside institutional channels. The knowledge William had gathered and preserved largely disappeared, scattered across pseudonymous publications that nobody connected to their actual author. The IQ claims that emerged posthumously complicated everything further. Helena, defending her brother's legacy, reportedly claimed he'd scored between 250 and 300 on an intelligence test administered shortly before his death. Whether this test actually occurred, whether the scores are meaningful, whether they represent accurate measurement, all disputed, all unprovable. But the number stuck. Highest IQ ever recorded became part of William's legend, a figure that seemed to quantify his genius while actually obscuring the complex reality of his intellectual life and psychological struggles. Modern discussions of William often fixate on that IQ figure, debating its validity, comparing it to other prodigies, arguing about measurement methodology. These arguments miss the point entirely. Intelligence isn't a single score. It's not height or weight, something measurable with simple instruments. William's intelligence manifested in rapid language acquisition, intuitive mathematical understanding, pattern recognition across disparate fields. But it also manifested in his survival strategies, his ability to rebuild repeatedly, his capacity to find satisfaction in work others considered beneath him. The question isn't whether his IQ was really 250 or 300. The question is why we need that number, why we're so desperate to quantify something that resists quantification. Maybe because numbers feel definitive, final, easier than grappling with the messy reality of a human being who was both extraordinary and deeply damaged. Contemporary psychology has language for what William experienced that didn't exist during his lifetime. Gifted child syndrome describes the pattern. exceptional cognitive abilities combined with social and emotional challenges. Asynchronous development explains how intellectual growth can outpace emotional maturity, creating internal conflicts that persist into adulthood. William's story fits these patterns perfectly. His intellectual precocity was real, not fabricated by ambitious parents. But his emotional and social development couldn't keep pace with his cognitive abilities. At 11, he could lecture Harvard professors on advanced mathematics, but he couldn't navigate basic peer relationships. That gap never closed. At 46, he was still carrying the psychological wounds from childhood humiliation, still running from recognition, still unable to reconcile his abilities with his need for normalcy. Modern gifted education has learned from cases like William's. The emphasis has shifted from pure acceleration to holistic development. Schools now consider social and emotional readiness alongside cognitive ability. Parents are warned about the dangers of pushing too hard, too fast. But have we really learned? The pressure to create prodigies hasn't disappeared. It's just become more sophisticated, more widespread. Every middle-class parent with access to educational resources now faces the question, how much is too much? When does nurturing talent become exploitation? William's story gets invoked in these debates constantly. He's the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you push too hard. But that framing does him a disservice because it reduces his complex life to a simple moral. Don't push your kids. The reality is more complicated. Boris and Sarah didn't create William's abilities through intensive early education. They recognized existing potential and tried to develop it. Their methods were aggressive, probably damaging, but William's intelligence was real regardless of their approach. The tragedy wasn't the early education. The tragedy was the public exposure, the circus atmosphere, the transformation of a child into a spectacle. Boris could have nurtured William's abilities privately, protecting him from media attention until he was mature enough to handle it. Instead, he promoted William aggressively, using his son's achievements to validate his educational theories. That's where the damage occurred. Not in teaching a toddler to read, but in parading an 11-year-old before reporters and professors, creating expectations no human could fulfill. William's later life represents a different kind of tragedy, the waste that occurs when exceptional ability is suppressed rather than developed. He spent decades hiding his intelligence, pretending to be less than he was, avoiding any situation that might reveal his capabilities. That suppression was necessary for his psychological survival, but it meant his potential contributions to mathematics, physics, history, and transportation planning were lost. The knowledge he could have shared, the insights he might have offered, all remained locked away because sharing meant exposure. Society failed William twice, first by making him a spectacle, then by making him a pariah. The same public that celebrated him at 11 mocked him at 20, then forgot him entirely by 30. He couldn't win. Fame destroyed him, but obscurity meant his work would never be recognized. The manuscripts that survived offer tantalizing glimpses of what might have been. The cosmology work anticipated concepts that wouldn't be formalized for decades. The transportation analysis identified efficiency improvements that cities still need. The historical research preserved knowledge that mainstream historians were ignoring. This wasn't the work of someone who'd failed or wasted their potential. This was sustained intellectual productivity at the highest level, conducted in isolation, hidden from recognition, disconnected from the academic community that might have valued it. Buckminster Fuller's discovery of the animate and the inanimate decades later proved that William's later work could withstand serious scholarly scrutiny. Fuller, himself a significant intellectual figure, recognized the manuscript's quality immediately. His excited letter to Gerard Peel expressed genuine admiration for William's cosmological thinking. But Fuller's endorsement came too late to rehabilitate William's reputation. By the time scholars might have reconsidered his contributions, the failed prodigy narrative was too firmly established. Reconsidering William meant challenging a story everyone thought they understood, and most people weren't interested in that complexity. So the work remained marginalized. The author remembered primarily for childhood achievements and adult failure, while his actual intellectual production during his adult years went largely unexamined. What would have happened if William had been born 50 years later? Would modern understanding of gifted children have protected him from the worst exploitation? Would privacy laws have prevented the media circus? Would therapeutic support have helped him integrate his abilities with his emotional needs? Maybe. Or maybe the pressure would have taken different forms, equally damaging. Social media would have amplified his fame and humiliation exponentially. The internet would have preserved every mistake, every awkward moment, every failure to live up to expectations. The exposure would have been even more invasive, more permanent, more inescapable. Technology changes the mechanisms of exploitation and exposure, but it doesn't eliminate the fundamental problem. Exceptional children are vulnerable, and society tends to treat them as spectacles or resources rather than as human beings who need protection and support. William's story remains relevant because that problem persists. Every generation produces children with extraordinary abilities, and every generation faces the question of how to nurture those abilities without destroying the children who possess them. The answer isn't to avoid developing talent. The answer is to remember that gifted children are children first, gifted second. Their cognitive abilities don't eliminate their need for normal childhood experiences, for peer relationships, for emotional development, for protection from adult pressures and expectations. William never had that protection. From infancy, he was his parents' experimental subject, their proof of concept, their validation. By the time he was old enough to have his own desires, he'd been so thoroughly shaped by their ambitions that he couldn't separate his own identity from their expectations. His flight into anonymity was an attempt to finally discover who he might have been without all that pressure. But he never found out because the damage was permanent. He spent his adult life reacting against his childhood rather than building something new. That's what makes his story tragic rather than just sad. Not that he failed to achieve greatness, but that he never got the chance to discover what his own version of greatness might have looked like. Every choice he made was defensive, protective, reactive. He was still being shaped by Boris and Sarah decades after their direct influence had ended. On July 17, 1944, William James Sidis died carrying a photograph of a woman he'd loved but never truly known, surrounded by manuscripts that proved his continued brilliance but would never receive recognition. Having successfully achieved the anonymity he'd sought, but finding it hollow, having escaped the pressures of fame, only to discover that escape itself becomes a prison when it requires abandoning everything that makes you who you are. Human potential is fragile, easily damaged by pressure or neglect, by exposure or isolation, by expectations that are either too high or too low. William's life demonstrates that there's no simple formula for nurturing exceptional ability without causing harm. But it also demonstrates that the harm comes primarily from treating people as symbols rather than as individuals, as prodigies rather than as human beings. He deserved better protection, better support, better understanding. He deserved the chance to develop his abilities on his own timeline, to pursue his interests without public scrutiny, to make mistakes without becoming a spectacle, to succeed without being turned into a symbol. What he got instead was fame at 11, humiliation at 16, obscurity at 20, and death at 46. His actual accomplishments unrecognized because the world had already decided what his story meant. The tragedy of William James Sidis isn't that he was the smartest person who ever lived and wasted it. The tragedy is that we'll never know what he might have accomplished if we just let him be human. The photograph William carried until his death wasn't evidence of romantic failure. It was proof that he'd learned something his parents never intended to teach him. That being known is dangerous, that connection requires vulnerability, and that vulnerability leads to pain. Martha Foley married someone else, built a career, probably forgot about the awkward young man from that protest decades earlier. But William kept her picture because she represented a moment when someone saw him as a person rather than a phenomenon. One moment in 46 years. That's what his life had become. His sister Helena tried to correct the record after his death. She told people about the IQ test, the score between 250 and 300, the highest ever recorded. She preserved his manuscripts, argued for their importance, pushed back against the failure narrative. But she was fighting against a story everyone already believed. The failed prodigy was better entertainment than the successful recluse. The cautionary tale was more useful than the complicated truth. And maybe that's the real reason William's story persists. We need cautionary tales. We need warnings about pushing children too hard, about sacrificing childhood for achievement, about the dangers of treating kids as experiments. William provides all of that, wrapped up in a tragic narrative that feels satisfying in its completeness. But using his life as a warning means ignoring what actually happened. He didn't stop being brilliant. He didn't waste his potential. He made a choice that most people can't understand. He chose obscurity over recognition, privacy over achievement, survival over success. That choice cost him everything the world values: fame, recognition, academic position, professional respect, the satisfaction of being acknowledged for his work. But it gave him something else, the ability to exist without constant scrutiny, to pursue knowledge without pressure, to be human rather than symbol. Was it worth it? The question doesn't have an answer because we're not the ones who had to live with the consequences. William made the only choice he could see that would keep him alive psychologically. Whether that was the right choice, whether a better option existed, whether different circumstances might have allowed different outcomes, all irrelevant. This was the life he lived, and judging it from the outside misses the point entirely. The manuscripts he left behind don't prove he succeeded or failed. They prove he never stopped thinking, never stopped working, never stopped being the person his parents had shaped him to become, even while desperately trying to escape that identity. Black holes predicted in 1925. Transportation systems analysed while working as a bookkeeper. 1,200 pages on American history written in stolen moments. A perpetual calendar patented under his real name because legal documents couldn't hide. Indigenous history preserved through wampum belt analysis while the academic establishment ignored entire peoples. This isn't the resume of a failure. This is what intellectual productivity looks like when it's divorced from institutional support and public recognition. It's what happens when someone brilliant enough to revolutionize multiple fields deliberately removes themselves from the systems that would have amplified their work. We want to believe that talent always finds recognition, that genuine ability can't be suppressed, that brilliance inevitably shines through. William's life proves otherwise. Exceptional ability combined with deliberate obscurity equals invisibility. The work exists, but nobody sees it. The insights are real, but nobody applies them. The knowledge is preserved, but nobody accesses it. That's the actual tragedy. Not that William stopped being a genius, but that his genius became useless because he had to hide it to survive. The court decision in his lawsuit against the New Yorker established precedent that still shapes privacy law. If you're famous as a child, even involuntarily, you forfeit privacy rights permanently. The public's right to observe you, judge you, document your life, that becomes permanent. No statute of limitations, no opportunity to withdraw consent you never gave. Think about what that means for every child who becomes famous now. Every kid on YouTube, every teenage influencer, every young athlete or performer, they're creating a permanent record that will follow them forever. They can't escape it later. They can't say they've changed their mind about public exposure. The fame becomes permanent, whether they want it or not. William was the test case for this principle. His childhood fame, created by his parents and amplified by the press, removed his right to adult privacy. The legal system formalized what society had already decided. Once a spectacle, always a spectacle. He died trying to escape that principle, died still running from recognition, still hiding from the identity that had been forced on him at age 11. The cerebral hemorrhage was sudden, but maybe inevitable. Maybe that's what happens when you spend 23 years in constant psychological flight, always looking over your shoulder, always ready to abandon everything when recognition threatens.